Hello YouTube! So, do abstract objects exist? What I want to do in this video is just outline my take on this question. Now a first problem we have to deal with when asking this question is, what exactly is an abstract object? It turns out that defining the distinction between abstract objects and concrete objects is actually really difficult. And I'm not going to go into the debate about that. I'm just hoping that anybody watching this video has some intuitive sense of what that distinction is supposed to be. But briefly, the way that philosophers usually talk about this, abstract objects are supposed to be non-causal, they have no causal powers, they're non-spatio-temporal, so they don't exist in space and time. The standard examples of abstract objects are things like numbers, sets, and other mathematical objects. Whereas, and this contrasts with concrete objects like hands and tables and chairs and protons and neutrons and so on. The objects that are sort of found in your everyday perceptions are concrete objects, but then in mathematics, for instance, we seem to talk about objects like the number 5, and the number 5, that's not something you see, and it doesn't seem to, it doesn't sort of seem to exist in the world, at least not in space and time and so on. So that's the basic distinction, and then the question is, well, are there abstract objects? Does the number 5, for instance, really exist? Okay, what's my take on this? Well, I think that a first thing to note is that the standard way of framing this question about whether or not there are abstract objects, when in the standard ways of framing this, concrete objects tend to be kind of taken for granted. So we sort of take it for granted that there are hands and trees and fields and cars and planets and protons and neutrons and so on. And so we have a sort of, worldview where we have space and time and it's populated with all of these concrete objects. And then there's this problem of, well, how do we fit abstract objects into this worldview? And then the issue is, well, if we think of abstract objects as being, by definition, non-spatio-temporal and non-causal, then we run into a whole load of sort of difficulties accounting for things like how we're supposed to know about them. So in the case of concrete objects, accounting for our knowledge of concrete objects is fairly straightforward. So take my hand, right? Well, my hand exists out there in the world. I believe that I have a hand. How did I come to have knowledge of my hand? Well, there's this object out there, light hits the object, it bounces off the object, interacts with my eyes, and so on, and then whatever. There's some sort of brain process that occurs. But the point is that I can enter into these causal relationships with this object out there, and that gives us a very straightforward account of how I can have knowledge of this object. Whereas with abstract objects, given that they are non-spatio-temporal, that they have no causal powers, it's not at all clear how I could have knowledge of them. So the number 5, right? Well, the number 5 doesn't exist it doesn't exist in the world. It's not something I can perceive or interact with in any way. How do I get knowledge of this stuff? Okay, that's a problem. All right, so that's the sort of usual way the debate is framed, right? We are kind of taking a worldview for granted where we have concrete objects, and then there is this problem of abstract objects. Now, I think what I want to say is, well, I'm a constructivist about all objects. So I would say that hands, tables, chairs, planets, and so on, these objects exist only relative to particular perspectives, and they exist in virtue of the fact that we are kind of arbitrarily drawing lines and drawing boundaries in particular ways. We make concrete objects up. And the And how this applies to abstract objects is, well, I would say just as we can construct concrete objects, we can similarly construct abstract objects. So, okay, to explain this in a bit more detail, the first thing to say is that concrete objects are really weird. They're really bizarre. There's all sorts of philosophical problems that that can be pushed against the existence of concrete objects. So, for example, there are problems of vagueness. So if I take a hand, well, the hand has certain boundaries, and then I can say, like, this is, there's like an atom here that is part of the hand, and then there's an atom here that's part of the arm, not part of the hand. But then where exactly is the line between hand and arm? There's going to be some sort of point as you kind of move up, where it's just not at all clear whether or not there's an atom counts as being part of the hand. Similarly, you can consider at what point, if you were to make changes to a hand, we can imagine like altering a hand atom by atom. Imagine like a series of objects where you start with this hand and then you alter it atom by atom until you end up with a scrambled egg. And then the question is, well, like, again, where's the line? Like, when does it stop being a hand? Where in that sort of series of changes do we go from, this is a hand to this is not a hand? So there's this problem of vagueness. Another problem is the problem of the many. So the problem of the many is, if you take my hand and we say that, if we say that there's a hand here, then there's going to be some set of atoms that is identical with that hand. Presumably, like, the reason why there's a hand here is because there's a set of atoms, or I don't know, other parts or whatever that make up this hand. But there's going to be trillions of other sets of atoms that differ minutely from that initial set of atoms, and those trillions of other sets of atoms seem to have like perfectly equal legitimate claims to being hands. So if you take the set of atoms that constitutes this hand, and then you take one atom away, well, what you end up with is a set of atoms that has a totally legitimate claim to being a hand. And I mean, that set of atoms is there, right? So there's basically trillions of sets of atoms that all have perfectly legitimate claim to being a hand. And so we seem to end up with this conclusion that if there's a hand here, then there's actually trillions of hands here. That's a bit strange. There are philosophical problems about under what circumstances two objects compose a further object. Like, do the objects need to be in contact? Do they actually need to have physical contact with each other? Is it enough for there to be some sort of, other type of influence? Or maybe, there's some sort of functional role that the two parts play, and that's what makes them a further object. There's actually even a causal problem with concrete objects, because a lot of the ordinary objects of perception, like hands, you might argue, are causally redundant. Because whatever... So, like, if I say, well, I'm perceiving a hand, and then I give some sort of causal model for this, well, it's not quite true to say that, light hits the hand and then bounces off the hand and hits my eyes. I mean, what's happening, strictly speaking, at least on the standard physicalist model, is, you have photons that are interacting with atoms just on the surface of the hand, and then that's bouncing off. So the point is that anything that you claim, any kind of causal claim that's made about what this hand is doing, it seems that that's preempted by the causal powers of the atoms that compose the hand. So actually the hand itself just doesn't have any causal role. It's causally redundant. So, okay, these are just some of the philosophical problems that that arise when we start thinking about concrete objects. Now, the sort of view that I have is that all of the concrete objects of our perception are actually just, I mean, we just make them up, basically. They're just made up, right? So, I mean, you could, if you want, say, I suppose, that there just are no concrete objects, at least no ordinary objects. You could, if you want, say that, well, maybe there just are no hands on this sort of view. What I would prefer to say is, no, there are hands, but hands are constructed. Like, we make things up so that there are hands. And actually, I mean, if you say that there are no hands, so one sort of view, for instance, is mereological nihilism. A standard mereological nihilist will say that there are no composite objects, and there are only simple parts. Sorry, not parts. There are just simples, and these simples never compose a further object. So we might think of these as being like fundamental particles, right? There are just fundamental particles arranged hand-wise, but there are no hands. A mereological nihilist will say that. My view actually is that mereological nihilism is one perfectly legitimate way of constructing objects, but I don't take it to have any I don't take that to be in any way like more accurate or more true or more legitimate than the common sense way that we construct objects. So in the common sense way that we construct objects, we draw all sorts of boundaries around composite macroscopic objects. We kind of project composite macroscopic objects onto the world, and we say, I have hands. I endorse a kind of global constructivism about objects. And okay, that's concrete objects. So from that point of view then, it's perfectly fine to say that, hands exist and tables and chairs and so on exist, but they exist from certain perspectives, right? There are certain kind of object frameworks, as it were, that we have constructed, and it's within those frameworks we say that these objects exist, but that's as far as it goes. Now, if we then turn to the question of abstract objects, well, I mean, the way I would see this is that in just the same way that we construct concrete objects, you can construct abstract objects. In fact, mental abstraction seems like a very straightforward process to me. So we can take an object of a particular shape and say, oh, this object is square, right? I mean, I'm looking at my computer right now, and I guess it's rectangular, right? So I say, okay, the screen is rectangular. Now, of course, the screen is not perfectly rectangular. If I was to sort of zoom in, I would find actually there's all sorts of deviations from a kind of perfect rectangle. But what's happening here, I think, is that I'm looking at this object, and then I'm abstracting, right, from what I see. I'm simplifying. So I can take it that the computer, obviously, it doesn't actually instantiate a perfectly straight line, but I can imagine that there is a perfectly straight line there, and then I can kind of construct this kind of ideal rectangle. And one thing I could say is that, I mean, I could actually just say, well, the computer just instantiates rectangularity, and that's sort of true enough, given the sort of context in which I'm speaking. Like in an everyday context, it's true enough to say that the computer is just, the shape of the computer's screen is just rectangular, and then I just take it as if it instantiated a perfectly straight line, and it was a perfect ideal rectangle. So okay, what's happening is I'm looking at this object, I'm kind of abstracting and sort of treating it as though it was composed of these very simple, perfectly straight lines, and then I can engage in this other in this other type of abstraction and consider rectangularity in general. I can think of like other things that instantiate rectangularity, and then I can investigate the properties of rectangularity in general, just rectangularity. So I mean, there's no. It doesn't seem to me like there's really any kind of there's really any philosophical problem here, right? Like this is just clearly something that human beings have the cognitive capacity to do. Is in the same way I would say that we can, sort of draw boundaries in such a way that we create the computer. And when I say create the computer, I mean, we create it via the sort of boundary drawing. Obviously, we also create it in the sense that we've put the parts together physically. But I mean, like I can like walk into a room and then I'm kind of classifying and drawing boundaries in such a way that I'm conceptualizing this thing as there's a computer. Well, in the same way that we do that, we can construct rectangularity, or with numbers, right? I can say like, oh, that's a computer, that's a phone, that's a cup, and so I now have this thing, this threeness, right? And then I can investigate the properties of threeness. And this is just a product of construction, but it's not fundamentally different to the way in which concrete objects are constructed. And in fact, I would say, from this sort of point of view, there really isn't actually a fundamental difference between concrete objects and abstract objects. Because when you think about these problems, the problem of vague boundaries, the problem of the many, all of this, one way to interpret what is going on when we say that, there is a hand, despite despite the fact that we have this problem of vague boundaries, that we have this problem of the many and all that stuff, one way to interpret what's going on is that we're abstracting. So like I can say like, here is a hand, here is one hand. But I mean, actually, okay, we have this situation where we could just as well say that there are trillions of hands. For pragmatic purposes, we kind of project a single hand where we could say that there are trillions and trillions of hands. Or maybe another example of this is to think about the sorts of properties that we assign to objects. So consider something like the length of a coastline. Well, a coastline is a concrete object, but I mean, what exactly is the coastline? Well, if you try to say like what the length of a coastline is, the smaller your unit of measurement, the longer the length the coastline will be. Or maybe actually another way to put this is like the smaller your unit of measurement, you're just going to get a different, like as you change the units of measurement, you're going to get different coastlines. So if you take an island and you have different units of measurement, you can generate different coastlines for that island. I mean, strictly speaking, I would say it seems perfectly reasonable to say that there's not really any such thing as the length of the coastline, and there's not really any such thing as the coastline. But we adopt a particular unit of measurement, and then we kind of apply that, and then sort of you apply that unit of measurement and construct this thing, the coastline. Or think about something like a person's height. So I can say, for instance, Verity's height is 5'6". Now, in fact, Verity's height, first of all, is going to change throughout the day. Like as she lays down, she'll get a bit taller. In sort of different environments, the height will change very slightly. And of course, even if you take Verity at one moment in time, if you zoom in far enough, there's not going to be any like determinate boundary between Verity and the rest of the environment, because like any sort of particle is, I mean, first of all, you won't be able to specify exactly which particles count as part of Verity. And even if you could specify which particles count as part of Verity, particles are more like clouds of probability. They're like smeared out over space. So strictly speaking, there isn't any such thing as Verity's height, right? So like Verity's height, I mean, even if you were to say something like, even if you were to make a claim where you make a sort of interval claim where you say, well, Verity's height is between 5'5" and 5'7". No, there's still an abstraction going on there, because the point is that when you say like Verity's height is between 5'5" and 5'7", you're still presupposing that there is this property of Verity's height. That Verity has some determinate height that is lying in that interval. And actually, no, that's not strictly speaking what's going on. Or perhaps I should say, you can very easily adopt perspectives from which it just doesn't even make sense to talk about things like Verity's height, right? Verity's height is something that manifests once we propose a particular classification scheme, once we have particular types of instrumentation for measurement and so on, like it's within that perspective that you get Verity's height. But that's something which that's not something that is like a property of a concrete object, at least as concrete objects have been traditionally conceived. So what I want to say is that even when we're talking about concrete objects, there's actually a kind of abstraction going on. So the abstract and the concrete are already kind of intertwined in a very deep way. So what does what's the point of all of this? I suppose then, do abstract objects exist? Well, I want to say, yeah, actually, I'm happy to say that abstract objects exist. Abstract objects exist in... They have a sort of equal claim to existence as concrete objects do. Both concrete objects and abstract objects are perfectly legitimate objects of construction. So, I would say that, yeah, I mean, insofar as hands and tables and chairs and so on exist, I'm happy to say that numbers and sets and other mathematical objects, for instance, exist, or that I don't know, like triangularity or squareness in the abstract, right? Like that exists. That's fine. So I suppose that I would, in some sense, like I'm certainly not a Platonist, right? Like I don't think that there are objective, mind-independent or stance-independent abstract objects. But then I don't think there are objective, mind-independent, stance-independent concrete objects either. So, that's my view. That's my take on the abstract concrete distinction. And that is all I have to say, I think, for this video. Yep, I think that's long enough. I will leave that there. Thanks for watching.